Okay, we're going to pick up on this, our third of the 4 sessions. The last one will be on the 3rd of August, a week from today, same time here. I want to begin by recapitulating briefly some of what we did, that part of what we did last time that will be useful to allow me to go to the things we're going to do today. And the best way I know how to do that is to remind you of this central notion of class that we stressed last time, the concept of class that Marx contributed, the new one, a new way of thinking about class that does not look at it in terms of rich versus poor or powerful versus powerless, differences that are important and that Marx was very interested in. But I want to focus on what Marx contributed new, because those ideas existed before Marx was born for a long time. And that new idea, as you recall, was the notion that in all human societies, there's a part of the population that works, produces goods and services, and a part that doesn't. And the part that produces goods and services always produces more goods and services than it itself consumes, thereby making it possible for the people who don't work to nonetheless consume. The only way people can consume who don't work is if the people who work produce more than they consume. Simple idea, but like all big ones, it eluded an awful lot of folks. So Marx began by saying the society, every society, has to organize that process. Whether it is conscious of what it is doing or not, it organizes. It has to make the decision. Who is going to be a worker who produces surplus? Who is not? That in the society right away is going to be distinguished between those who produce more than they get, and therefore those who get more than they produce because they don't produce anything, or they don't produce anywhere near what they need to survive or to consume. So every society has to decide that, one way or another. Explicitly, implicitly, they have it. And that's Marx's first insight. And his second insight is how society does it. How it decides who produces the surplus, who doesn't, is only part of what it has to decide. It also has to decide who gets the surplus that's produced by those who produce the surplus. Because the people who get it are then in a position, of course, to distribute it, that surplus. That is, they can distribute it to themselves, or they can distribute it back to the people who produced it. There's another possibility. Or they can distribute it to a whole other group of people. People who are not producing it, and unlike them, are not appropriating it, but live off distributions. For example, if I produce a surplus, let's use numbers just to make it simple. I produce 100 of whatever, and I consume a portion, 60. That makes the surplus 40. So the question is, who gets the 40? Do I, because I produced it? Does somebody else, for whatever reason? And if someone else gets the 40, what does he or she do with it? Do they consume it themselves? Do they consume a portion and distribute it to yet other people who can therefore live because they get a distributed portion of the surplus? Every society makes these decisions. Every society solves this problem because there is no way to be a society without solving that problem. So they do it. But they may do it through religious ritual. They may do it unconsciously. They may do it through mechanisms that they see or understand altogether differently. But Marx's insight is, whether or not they understand it, no matter how they understand it, every society does it. And the big punchline, the big punchline for Marx is, it turns out that how the society organizes the production, who produces it, the appropriation, who gets the surplus, and then the distribution throughout society, how that's done shapes everything else in that society. Influences the culture, the politics, the economics, the art, whatever. So it's a very powerful influence within society, but before Marx, not very well understood and mostly not understood at all. Much as in the United States today, and in much of the world beyond the United States, that sentence is still true. This theory is not taught. This way of thinking about an economic system is not presented. It is not stressed. It's not repeated. Radically different ways of understanding how society works are reproduced. So it is still an agenda for Marxists today to do what Marx did, which is to say, hey, let's pay attention to the production, appropriation, and distribution of the surplus, because, as Marx will show, and as I'm going to try to show here, it is very influential in all the other aspects of life. And therefore, if you want to change a society in fundamental ways, you cannot afford to act as if this isn't an issue. That is, to be very blunt, if you're a socialist and you would like to move the world beyond capitalism, you have two tasks from Marx's perspective. In addition to whatever else you're trying to understand about the capitalism you want to go beyond and the socialism you want to create, you also have to understand how capitalism organizes the production appropriation of surplus and how that supports its military, shapes its ideology, and creates all the obstacles to social progress that Marxists think it does. And likewise, you have to ask and answer the question, how would a socialist or communist or whatever you want to call it, new, different, better society, how would it, whatever else it does, how would it organize the surplus differently? If you don't do that, and I'm going to be provocative now, and I don't have the time to prove it to you, but I'm going to give you a title of a book that does this. Otherwise, here's what can happen to you, and what happened to the left. This is obviously my perspective here. You can make a revolution in 1917 in Russia. You can create a new society, the Soviet Union. You can radically alter the classes, by which you mean the rich and the poor. You take wealth away from the rich and you distribute it to large numbers of poor people, which the Soviets did. And you can radically alter the distribution of power. People who wielded great power before the Russian Revolution didn't afterwards. And people who didn't wield much before wielded a lot afterwards. So Russia radically changed the class structure in terms of who owns and who doesn't. And it radically changed the class structure in terms of who has power and who doesn't. But now the Marxian question. Did they radically alter the organization of the surplus? Well, there are fundamental changes in who produced it, who got it, who distributed it, and how they distributed it. And I'm going to provoke you now. My answer in general is they didn't change it much. And partly because they didn't think about it much. If you read about what happened in Moscow, in Leningrad, in those years, the great debates of Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and all the others, they were full of passion about a whole lot of things. Changing the distribution of wealth, changing the distribution of income, changing the distribution of power. Wonderful, really interesting. Did they have long conversations about reorganizing the production, appropriation, and distribution of the surplus? None at all. None at all. Very occasional, oblique references. So an interesting thing happened. The leaders didn't think like that, but neither did the masses. Workers and groups of workers. If you've ever read the story, and if you never have, one of the most exciting books you can read, and you should read if you never have. It's a wonderful book about the Russian Revolution by an American journalist who just happened to be there, named John Reed, R-E-E-D. Wrote a wonderful book called 10 Days That Shook the World. It's around in paperback editions, but it's for American audience particularly because it's an American in Moscow at the time, in Leningrad, and trying to understand this revolution all around him, and it's very worthwhile. In any case, the workers took over factories, and with great excitement, they announced to the managers and the owners of the factories on Monday, this was Friday afternoon late, on Monday, don't come in. We are firing you. It's a wonderful idea. It's not the boss who fired the workers fired the boss. Don't come in on Monday. We suggest you leave town for your own safety, which many of them did. And the workers, with great excitement, over the weekend, massed at the factory, and in a great group, marched to the Winter Palace of Smolny, if you know the story of what happened in Moscow and Leningrad in the 1917 days. And with great excitement, they marched to where the Bolshevik Party, Lenin, and the others were sitting, making sure everything was working, and they announced, in the name of the Soviet Union, the new organization, the new society, we have taken the property of the capitalists and we turn it over to you. And with great excitement and great feeling, they did that. It is now the property of the people, not of those capitalists. And it will now be run by the workers' government, led by the Bolshevik Party. And then those workers, I'm doing this a little bit stylized, but I want to get the point home, then those workers turned around and singing a wonderful Bolshevik song, went home. And Monday morning, they came back to work. And a new group of people were running the factory. They were commissars. They were delegated, selected people, communists selected by the Bolshevik Party to now run the factory, to make sure that it produced. And the workers came at 9 in the morning and left at 5, kind of like they did before. And they produced more than they got as wages, kind of like they did before. And the surplus was appropriated not by a board of directors elected by shareholders, that's how it had been before, but instead by the people's commissars sent by the party, who took the surplus. Notice something. The personnel changed. The structure didn't. And it's not because the masses wanted it and the nasty Bolsheviks didn't give it. Not at all. Neither the Bolsheviks nor the workers had that in their minds. That's not what they thought a revolution was. And now the provocative point. I would argue that you were unable in the end in the Soviet Union to sustain the fantastic changes they achieved. Generalized education, generalized housing, generalized medical care, an unbelievable transformation of a backward society. In 1913, Russia was the backward border of Europe, behind in every way. 50 years later, this country, which went through World War I and World War II, where more Russians were killed than anybody else,